Hello and welcome to the Nonprofit Data Virtual Seminar. This is our 8th seminar and our final seminar of the 2018-2019 session. In this series, we're sharing research that is about or using data on the nonprofit or third sector. It's been a bit of an experiment over the past year, but there's been a really good response to the series, and we certainly plan to return after the summer with some more presentations. So I'm delighted you're able to join us just now, or if you're watching the recording after the fact. Today we're looking at comparative data, making comparisons across countries using data about the nonprofit sector. I'm delighted we're going to be joined by Elizabeth Searing from the University at Albany and the State University of New York, who's going to look at the promise and perils of comparing nonprofit data across borders. And so Elizabeth joins us now. Hi, Elizabeth, how are you doing?
I'm doing well, Alasdair. Thanks for having me on the series.
Excellent. I'm glad you could join us. So just before we get started, just a reminder that if you have questions for Elizabeth, you can make them in the comments to the YouTube video. I will curate them and put some questions to Elizabeth at the end. But otherwise, I'll hand over to you and let you introduce yourself and take it from there.
All right. Perfect. Well, thank you, Alasdair. Give me just a second to share my screen. And are we good to go, Alasdair?
Yep, that's perfect. We can see and hear you. So on you go.
Oh, so you can see the slides. You cannot see me, correct?
I can see the slides. Yeah, that's perfect.
Perfect. Well, that is absolutely perfect. So, well, thank you to everyone for watching, whether you're joining us live or whether this is something that you've saved for later. As Alasdair mentioned, my name is Elizabeth Searing, and today is really less of a traditional formal research presentation than it is really of a conversation. True, it's a conversation where I'm going to do most of the talking, so it would be kind of a lousy first date, but hopefully an informative seminar for you. And it's unlike some of the other presentations that you've seen on the series so far, because today we're not going to be talking about a particular piece of work that I have done, but rather a selection of things that myself and others have done. And we're going to talk about the promise and perils of doing comparative data research. Now, when I say comparative, this means both the exposure of you as a researcher to a context that is outside of your own, in addition to the actual comparison in the research of two or more contexts. Because even if the research that you're doing, even if the paper isn't comparing two contexts, if you are outside where it is that you were originally trained, then you are still doing a comparison. So that's really what I mean when I say comparative. Now, this is a big topic, potentially even larger than you might initially think. It was definitely larger than I originally thought. So we'll be putting together a structure to the comparative inquiry today, in addition to kind of sprinkling examples of both mine and other people's work throughout. So who am I? Well, we've already kind of covered the employment basics. I'm an assistant professor in the Rockefeller College of Public Affairs and Policy, which is at the University at Albany in the state of New York. So for those of you that only know one thing about New York, and that's New York City, I'm about 2.5 hours north of there. I'm just wrapping up my 4th year here, and I teach primarily graduate level classes in charities or nonprofit management and in financial management. I've taught other classes on program evaluation and such before. And then most of my research specializes in the social sector. So most of it has some kind of financial flavor to it. Sometimes this is pretty straightforward accounting. Other times it's more legal or managerial, but I generally stick with the social sector. I was also the former executive director of a local 5-college institute here. I was the director for 2 years and stepped down last summer. I'm still on 2 local boards, and prior to this, I've held positions in multiple sectors. I've directed the Parks Department for my town. I've been a librarian. I've been the COO of a software company. I've been a stay-at-home mom. The point is that I've been a lot of things and seen a lot of phenomena from different angles, which I think helps a lot in comparative work. Off to the side, you can kind of see some pictures of other things that I do. Nonprofit capacity training in Malawi. I did social enterprise research in New Orleans, Louisiana. And I'm also a mother, spouse, and colleague. You can see a couple good friends and doctoral committee members down there in the lower right, Dennis Young and Bruce Seaman. So now you're probably thinking, okay, well, you sound lovely, Elizabeth. We should grab a tea or a burger sometime. But why are we talking about comparative nonprofit data today? So I've spent the last 8 years or so working with nonprofit and social economy data. Some of it I've collected by hand, others I've been handed and needed to understand. Now, I didn't set out to be a comparative scholar. This is something that came about really because of 2, what I like to think of as personality traits. The first is that I am very particular about data. If any of my colleagues are watching right now, they probably just rolled their eyes and said what they would consider a more accurate and potentially colorful phrase for my attention to detail on data. And that's fine. What makes me a bore at dinner parties makes me the person you want working with your data. And I happily embrace that. So this, plus having a truly atrocious memory, means that not only am I picky, but I overdocument. And this makes me a pretty solid data wonk. So I've spent, especially the last few years, developing data and research for different uses and projects. One of these projects is essentially a testament to this kind of fascination with categorization, which is the Social Enterprise Zoo. You kind of see off there to the right. This book, which I co-edited and contributed to, sidesteps the constant fight about how to define social enterprise by simply accepting that we're never going to agree on a single definition, and that it's always going to vary based on country, research question, policy, etc. So the best we can do is be honest and transparent about the definition and conditions that we're working with. And I think this is a great spot to begin thinking about comparative work, honestly, because one of the first problems that you're going to encounter in contemplating comparing what the US audience would call nonprofit data is defining exactly what that is in a way that transcends borders. Even in the US, there is discussion over whether to call tax-exempt organizations, which is a phrase that really only the accountants like, nonprofits or not-for-profits. The US audience doesn't particularly like charities because it's considered to have connotations of begging, but also because the most common type of income for US nonprofits is actually earned income. So it's a bit of a misnomer. But there are many countries which either forbid or limit the amount of earned income that a tax-exempt organization can have. And in this case, we often find that NGO, non-governmental organization, or CSO, civil society organization, is more popular. Social enterprise is even broader, and if you ever want to see a fight break out among social enterprise researchers, ask them to define and come to an agreement on what social enterprise is. Is it nonprofit? Is it for-profit? Everywhere outside the US, cooperatives are also included, but in the US, it's almost an afterthought because we have a cooperative sector, but nowhere near as strong as many other places. So the most inclusive term is the term social economy, which is the one I have a tendency to use when I describe my own work, but this is a very uncommon term in the US. So I don't mind being uncommon. I identify as a social economy researcher and a sector agnostic one at that. That means that I believe social good can be accomplished in any number of legal forms, and your tax exempt status is really just a decision that you make along the way that reflects your mission, likely revenue sources, and your institutional environment. I do spend time in certain pockets of the social economy, though, more than others, such as US and now Canadian nonprofit financial management and comparative social enterprise. I'm also rules-centric, as you'll notice through today's talk. I tend toward the finance and the legal, not necessarily because I like following rules, but because I find the shades of gray in things that are thought to be relatively straightforward, and I think that that's particularly interesting. For charities, most of my experience has been in the US data, which is where I started, though most of my time now, and probably for the last year, has been spent in Canadian data. I have a growing familiarity with English and Scottish data. And then for the broader kind of social economy picture outside of charities and nonprofits, my context is not necessarily US centric, but is very Eurocentric, though I've had broader exposure through a kind of deliberate comparative projects. So where exactly, now that we've talked about, we've talked about me, we've talked about my context, let's talk about the data. It's nice to be a comparative theoretical researcher, but in my opinion, it's really not as satisfying. In order to get information on the way things are, you need data. But where do you find it? You're going to notice that the most common answer to a question in this presentation is, it depends. And also please remember my context, I'm Commonwealth centric. So please add in the comments or via email if your experiential context is different and you'd like to add to the pool of knowledge. So in some instances, information on charities is available directly from the government. This is often, but not necessarily, from the charity regulator. This is the case in both England and Scotland. You're able to download in a relatively friendly format some large data files for the population of charities. You're also able to search the government sites for individual charities, though the information on the Scottish one is slightly different than what you would get if you downloaded the whole kind of data kit and caboodle. In the United States, it did not used to be the case that the government would provide the data directly, but this has changed in recent years due to a lawsuit brought in 2015 that resulted in the courts compelling the Internal Revenue Service, or the IRS, who collects the annual forms from charities, to provide access to these annual filings in machine-readable format. Since then, there have been massive steps in providing data from the IRS directly to the public, though currently it really depends on what type of data you need. In my opinion, there are better locations for US data than the IRS, and we'll talk about those in a second. If you're looking for individual documents on an individual organization, there are organizations that we call watchdogs in the US that function as information clearinghouses. They describe their job as empowering individual donors with the information that they might need. One of the most well-known of these is GuideStar, which is now known as Candid. They provide this service in addition to additional data and services for a fee. Charity Navigator is another watchdog that provides 990 forms in addition to a ranking based on formulas that they've devised. I've actually been part of a team that helped devise some of them, though there are others other formulas that they use that I'm not a giant fan of. And these public interfaces are very useful, but for researchers that need more than just a handful or a couple dozen of organizations, these can be very cumbersome unless you're willing to spend some money. And speaking of spending money, back in the day when I first got started in this, that was really how you accessed the US nonprofit data. When I first started researching the National Center for Charitable Statistics, I'll probably be abbreviating that as the NCCS, maintained several databases with different levels of detail in them, and access was available for a fee. Only one of these databases was really sufficiently detailed for intricate financial work. So in case anyone is wondering why 1998 through 2003 is the most popular frame of study in the nonprofit sector for nonprofit finance, it's because those are the years in what is called the digitized data set, where the NCCS had a grant to input a large amount of detail from the 990s into a large database. So it's not that anything particularly special happened during those years. That is data driven. But that revenue model disappeared with the lawsuit, and so now those data sets, the ones that were used to create a lot of the seminal works in charity finance, are now available for free from the NCCS. And though I still shop the NCCS catalog there, my preferred source now for US data is through the nonprofit Open Data Collective. This is an effort that's spearheaded by Dr. Jesse Lisi, who has been on the series before, in addition to several other scholars and funders. They're working with the data to make it more accessible, but also gathering information about it in one place and trying to improve its quality, which is very important. For example, you can download a lot of different files even right now from US charities that have filed online forms. But for researchers, this isn't generalizable to the nonprofit population, statistically speaking, because it's not all charities, just online filers. So one of the special projects that the Open Data Collective has been working on is developing survey weights that would make that data more representative. And I've provided the link there so that you can click through and kind of shop all of the goodies from these different locations. For Canadian data, there are organizations that where files can be downloaded singly or in small kind of doses, but the large databases and queries are currently only available via special request. This is changing, though. There is a group of scholars, including Dr. Susan Phillips, Dr. Nathan Grassi, who has also been on before, and of course, Jesse Lisi, that have secured a grant through the Social Science and Humanities Research Council and the Canadian government to bring the Canadian data public. One of the projects that has absorbed a good chunk of my time over the last year is actually working with this data to make it research ready. And we'll see a couple of examples about that in a bit. All right, so you have data. So now what? Well, the very nature of comparative work is that you're likely working with something outside of your familiar domain. So even though you're likely awash in quantitative information, you should really approach study with some very basic questions. Think qualitative, grounded theory type questions. Read the forms and instructions that generated your data. Look at the raw data. What is it exactly that you're looking at? Sometimes the descriptive information itself is interesting to others as publishable, but at the very least, it prepares you for more advanced questions, especially the form. I cannot emphasize enough the importance of actually having the form that was used to generate your data by the people that filled it out. Have that by your side every single time you work with data. It helps you get at the lived experience of what that form actually is. So once you're familiar with it, now start asking kind of the deeper questions. This not only helps generate research ideas, but it also keeps you alert for your own context traps. So for example, what is different or similar about the data that might be useful? When I started working with Canadian Annual Return, which is the T3010, one of the things that I first noticed was that not only was there information on government funding streams, which is also important and is captured in US Form 990 data, but the Canadians actually captured different levels of government funding, so federal, provincial, and municipal. This is different from and an improvement on many of the government funding studies that have been based on US information. which is why myself, Nathan Grassi, and Daniel Neely have generated a paper on, which is almost under review. Tried to get that out by today, almost. But that paper is what I would consider fascinating, but kind of a first level paper. So looking at revenue interactions in the Canadian context, it's not especially comparative. We're not comparing it to anything. And it's not really looking at the deeper question of why the Canadian form took the extra step of asking for that information. And why does the US form ask questions about 16 different types of revenue, but the Scottish form only asks 6? It's this kind of, is this reflective of actual differences in revenue portfolios between the US and between Scotland? Or is this more a reflection of the role of the regulator? Both of these, both the kind of the Canadian question and the Scottish question, they look like money questions, but every money question is actually tied to something that's deeper. And that's one of the themes that you'll see from today's talk. Everything is tied to everything else in comparative work. It's really about finding the balance between acknowledging these elements and chasing them down a rabbit hole from which your research paper will never get finished. So the kind of the last point is, don't overlook the usefulness of a crosswalk, especially of making it public. Often the lack of a crosswalk or instruction manual has prevented comparative work, even within the same country. An example of this, and this isn't the most fabulous, you should be able to read this. If not, it is a publicly available crosswalk available from the NCCS. It is the National Taxonomy of Exempt Entities classification system, so the NTEE. And it's the crosswalk between that and the North American Industry Classification System, which describes for-profit businesses. So it describes it's the nonprofit description of what the organization does versus the for-profit description of what the organization does. They were developed separately, and we couldn't compare them initially, which made things like the study of mixed markets or social enterprise or things like that difficult. And so this was constructed and is now publicly available. So if you ever need to conduct that crosswalk, then you have this tool available. So one of the projects that Nathan Grassi and I actually have coming out this summer is a user's guide to the Canadian data for those people who were trained on the US Form 990. It takes advantage of what we know is our contextual lens, having grown up research-wise anyway, on the Form 990, and walks people through the promise and pitfalls of using the T3010 information from Canada. For example, like watch out, missing and zero are both recorded the same way in the Canadian data, and parts of the form are optional, which means imputation of zeros gets complicated, but don't worry, we're going to walk you through it. So even though it was what could be considered a first step for us on some of our other Canadian work in understanding the data, just the user's guide, this instruction manual, is hopefully going to be worth something to those of you out there that will be interested in using the Canadian data once it comes online in a public way. And the same thing for the crosswalk that you're currently looking at. So don't overlook the usefulness of these kinds of instructional guides when working with the data. So I mentioned that comparative work is tied to everything else. So in hopes of making sense of it, at least for the purposes of today, I've put together a spectrum of sorts. Now, the spectrum isn't a causal tool. It is just a way of thinking in an organized fashion. And hopefully it will help you track the lines of thinking that shoot out to realms other than the one that is dealing with your current research topic. Like the revenues paper being related to the historical sense of government's role as a regulator that we were talking about earlier. Because you're always trying to be cognizant of a bunch of different factors, but not follow them down the rabbit hole. So kind of an aside, I strongly recommend, if you don't already, keeping an ideas journal, whether it's in OneNote or whether it's a little travel log, whatever. It helps you capture your thoughts about future ideas and papers while not distracting you from your current task. So you could be sitting there working on accounting rules, and then all of a sudden that thought about whether or not it is, the government's perception of regulation kind of ties into social norms, and it's really not what you're doing. So write it down in the notebook. As long as you map the rabbit hole and where it is, you can explore it later and not forget about it. So if you have not started that research habit, now is a good time to start. So looking at the actual spectrum, I structured it to go from the highly detailed topics out to kind of the bigger thoughts. Now, I understand, and I know that this reflects my context specifically. Like I said, always be open and cognizant of the context and the lens that you are bringing with you. Someone that specializes in social movements or international relations is going to have different elements on their spectrum, especially kind of over in the detail corner. But I think this provides a good illustration of where to start and how it's all connected. So we'll touch briefly on each one of these, and I'll give some examples, plus give some of my favorite readings for each section. All right, so we'll start with the rules. In this case, financial ones. The reason I start with rules is because there's often a great amount of detail in spelling out process and meaning, even to those within the context. So accounting or accountancy is something that challenges many people. So there are large quantities of written rules and guidance. Not that this means that there is no ambiguity. As a matter of fact, far from it. But you're more likely to find specific interpretation on what an asset is and compare that across boundaries than what a public good is, which can get very big, very messy, and very normative. So this is why a good place to start is in gathering all of the existing materials you can on the financial context. So not only do you gain an understanding of what you're looking at and what the lived experience of creating that data is like, but also how it's different from others that you might have experience with. So for example, the act of receiving pledges or promises to donate, which is what we're looking at here. Both Canadian and US GAAP, so accounting principles, allow for a certain amount of discretion in determining whether an unconditional pledge is enough of a sure thing for it to count as revenue at the time the promise is made. So in my experience, the Canadian standard is a little bit higher, but the rules are generally similar. Now, what isn't similar are the instructions on filling out the annual forms, where you can see the US allows that kind of amount of discretion to come through, but where the Canadian form requires that pledges be recognized as revenue in the period where they're honored, not when the pledge is made. So if you're comparing pledge revenue for these two periods, you're not actually comparing the same thing. And that's just one thing. There's actually a second reason kind of buried in here as well when you read through them. Notice that the US form reports the net amount. The US form actually does this for a lot of revenues, which irritates me a little as a pet peeve, but the Canadian form doesn't net out much, including not netting out the pledge revenue. So on the US form 990, you have pledges that have already subtracted something out, whereas on the Canadian, you don't. So again, you're not comparing apples to apples here. And that's something that you can piece together by looking at the guidelines. You also, in addition to getting the official guidelines from either the government or the accounting bodies that set standards, you also should get your hands on practitioner literature and examples as well, because the instructions on the form are not always the way that things are interpreted in real life. And I learned this through a series of projects based on overhead costs. Now, this is a chart from a project that Jesse Lisi and I did on the nonprofit starvation cycle. where we studied what are called overhead rates, which we defined using the US Form 990 data as the amount reported as management in general, plus the amount reported as fundraising. And we split it apart, and you can kind of see here what the components are. And we thought, you know, relatively straightforward. Overhead equals administrative plus fundraising, and the Form 990 made that relatively easy. So then I started a project a few years later looking for New York State, looking at the feasibility of a minimum overhead allowance for nonprofits getting state contracts, similar to a system used by the federal government. And what we actually found was that overhead meant many things to many people. And what we thought would be kind of a straightforward numbers project actually involved interviews and conceptual mapping like the one that we're looking at here. Because it turns out that some people used overhead to mean administrative expenses, while others used it to describe indirect expenses. So administrative kind of describes the function of the expense, while indirect describes how it's allocated to different cost centers. So it's kind of like describing a lion. So it's a carnivore. That's what it does. It eats meat. And it's found in the African savanna. Both of these statements are true. They're just describing different things. And any given cat can be one or the other or both or neither. So in this chart, we have a representation of a nonprofit with 3 different contracts. Each contract has programmatic and administrative components. And the nonprofit organization has direct and indirect costs. And there's overlap. But trying to design policy around a word, overhead, that has different meanings is very difficult, especially in this case where federal contracts tended to mean indirect and state contracts tended to mean administrative. And this is all the same country, just different levels of jurisdiction. So what we thought was simply an accounting paper, a numbers paper, actually turned out to be something much more complicated. Fast forward to now. Alasdair, myself, and a couple other people are in the middle of an international study of overhead. As I was looking at different definitions across nations, looking at the different forms, I'm noticing that some nations, like the US, capture administrative costs, while others, like England, capture indirect costs. And others, like Scotland, deliberately lump indirects in with everything else. So this study is going to be fun. We will keep you updated. So my best advice here, actually for all of the spectrum, but particularly finance, is to find a local. Alasdair and I were just talking the other day also about trading costs. We talked for a bit before it struck me that we were actually discussing 2 entirely different things. I was thinking of trading in terms of investment management, in terms of market trades, whereas he was thinking of trading in terms of the costs of operating an earned income stream or operating a shop. So it was actually even the same word in the same language, and we were both looking at the same form, but the context was very, very different, and this was very salient. So my understanding was entirely off, and it would not have been discovered unless I'd been talking to someone who was a part of the context. So there are professionals whose job it is to understand these rules in the context you're looking at. I strongly recommend finding them. So for the literature, before we leave accounting, specifically for charities, international comparative work on charities, I like Carolyn Cordery's work. Here are a couple, and I believe that the 2018 project actually has a couple other papers as well stemming from it. But beyond the accounting, say straightforward accounting, I also recommend reading especially some of Lori Mook's work on social accounting. It isn't comparative per se, but the breaking out of the mental and intellectual boxes that you need to do in order to create social accounting, where you're bringing valuation into new and sometimes really normative laden areas, is really kind of the same approach that you're going to be using for comparative work. So I strongly encourage it. Only a half step away from the financial rules are the legal ones. And there is a lot of overlap, especially in terms of regulating the nonprofit sector. For example, this is what I was referring to earlier regarding overhead. Both England and Scotland are subject to the same SORP or financial rules, but the compliance documents for the charities are different. In England, central office costs are expected to be indirect and distributed across different cost centers, while in Scotland, central office costs get put into charitable activities directly. So even though they have the same finance rules, the compliance document means that Scottish charities are going to look more efficient than English, just based on the compliance reporting guidance. Another space outside of compliance where I've done some research is in corporate forms. So, for example, if an entrepreneur wants to do some social good, which type of organization should they start up? In the US, which has options that vary state by state, this is an example of a study I did in Louisiana several years ago. I interviewed 6 social enterprises in an attempt to figure out what factors caused them to choose which organizational form. I headed in thinking that I already knew the answer, that this was going to be a revenue question. But what I found was actually that it was an autonomy question. People chose corporate form based on whether they wanted to maintain control. So it was not exactly what I expected. But there are also projects where the form itself is the variable of interest, like how did this form come about? And this is a legal question that really starts to pull you toward that rabbit hole of some of those other spectrum elements. So for example, this map is from a website maintained by several groups at New York University, tracking the different types of for-profit social enterprise that are legal state by state in the US. There's several different types, and even the same type will vary between states because the legislation might vary. So the benefit corporations in Texas and the benefit corporations in Illinois, you'll notice are both are green on this map. They both have enacted legislation. However, it may not be the exact same legislation. So there is a lot of variation. But it's not just the US. There is a lot of strong work, and I would potentially even say stronger, going on abroad in the field of social enterprise outside the US. This is an example of a categorization of social enterprise in the UK, put together by an organization called ESELA, the European Social Enterprise Law Association. Instead of just for-profit and nonprofit, like in the US, this European group includes 4 major types: associations, foundations, companies, and cooperatives, and then maps each country's unique legal forms, kind of using this nifty color key off to the side. So I'm showing the UK, but the report that's available on their website actually tackles many other countries and contexts as well. And they're not trying to bring uniformity to social enterprise, really just comparability, which is, I think, laudable. In legal issues particularly, you need to watch out for these nested levels of jurisdiction. For example, a charity here in New York is subject to regulation on multiple levels and by multiple agencies. I know that in the English annual charity filing, there is a list of other organizations which may have compliance claims on the charity that you get to look at. So be mindful of these when doing comparative work. If you're a European scholar, it may just be the US to you, but there are likely other levels of bureaucracy there. And as for literature, I really like web sources for legal. Many of the groups that are responsible for running these sites are well-funded, they're full of lawyers, they're professional associations, and most importantly, they're constantly updated because the regulations are always changing. I'm not saying that that the legal literature should be avoided, by no means. But for more so than anything else, I like the fact that these online reputable agencies can frequently update everyone. But I would definitely make sure that it is a reputable site. And there are many good comparative pieces out there, especially as you start to broaden outside of charities and into the larger social economy. I just read this piece here. It's by actually a scholar in Canada on the U.S. Benefit Corporation, and is a solid read. I really enjoyed it. All right, so we're doing two things now. First, we're still tied to legal issues. Policy and legal can even be synonymous, but we're also on the spectrum kind of taking a big step toward the normative. So let's look at the role of regulatory bodies, who they are, what they do, what are their limits. We've already touched on this a little, and it's related to other spectrum pieces, but the home kind of is here because the bodies themselves are actually often strongly influenced by factors such as political regime, dominant ideologies. Which nonprofits are in the spotlight might be, or actually probably tied to the political scene. I know that this is very much the case in the US right now. If you were a Kenyan in 5 years trying to figure out why the Planned Parenthood charities in the US saw massive spikes in donations in 2018 and 2019, you really need to look at the political issues and the kind of the political climate and discussions that are going on for insights on why that is happening. There are also advocacy elements here. In relation to charity data specifically, there are always changes. I mentioned earlier how the US data was becoming more available due to legal action and the compliance bodies being compelled to provide more. In Canada, there's recently a change that is actually causing less granularity to be made available. The details on this are still coming out, but remember, you don't have to be doing a project on policy for policy to have a major role in your research. I would also consider questions regarding government funding to also have a role here, not just about the kind of crowding out question that we brought up back in accounting, but also in what determines these levels of funding. That is often a political question. And also don't overlook using charity or social enterprise data to evaluate policy. I am currently anchoring a paper headed up by two of my awesome PhD students. And we're looking at the impacts of the creation of two different types of social enterprise in Puerto Rico. This policy initiative happened as a way to spur both socialness and the local economy. And we need to evaluate whether both or either actually happened. So you can see here that there was a lot of uptake. All of the different types of social enterprises that have been formed have been mapped there on the map of Puerto Rico. But we suspect that many of the social enterprises that started using this legislation are actually just as social as any other non-social business. Both students are actually headed there this summer to gain an understanding of what the situation actually is and talk to the business owners. So yes, this is a study of social enterprises and the good that they're doing, but it also on a much broader level is a question of policy success and whether or not the impacts are actually being felt, which really could apply to any number of policies out there. So don't limit yourself just because it happens to be charity data. So Puerto Rico isn't really comparative. We're just trying to understand a unique context on its own. So an example of a truly comparative project is ICSEM, the International Comparative Social Enterprise Mapping Project that was run by the MES Research Group. I was one of the original members of the US team and am still a member. And the project eventually included 43 country teams that interviewed a total of 721 social enterprises around the world. The goal of the project was really to see if we could develop a topology of social economy organizations, kind of regardless of national boundaries. We considered financial and legal factors, yes, but there were also governance concerns, membership, services provided. And the leaders of the project, Jacques Defourny and Marta Nissens, have begun publishing on those results. And if any of you are interested, many of the individual country teams have reports articles and even books on their own contexts within their own countries. So beyond the ICSEM, where I would encourage you to look at the MES website to find access to those reports. There are some other recommended readings. O'Halloran has some good works, I think. I really also enjoyed reading the second one for the Politics and Charity, the one from 1915. I enjoyed reading this for historical value. Really, there are certainly parts where it's outdated, but it's interesting to see foreshadowing of several themes that we still debate today, like the nature of philanthropy. It's fascinating to see the fact that it was being discussed over 100 years ago. And I also, especially in regards to politics and policy, strongly recommend that you step outside of Western economies, especially to get a grasp on the more critical elements of politics and policy. And I think this really helps explain why. There is, as always, a strong link between what I've dubbed on the spectrum politics and what I dub historical institutional. I make the division primarily a temporal one, though history contains elements of all of the other pieces on the spectrum. Here we see a worldwide illustration of Gini indices, which are measures of the gap between the most and least wealthy citizens in a country. This disparity drives a lot of things, including much of the activity and funding mechanisms in the social sector. And you may understand the historical dynamics of the massive amounts of disparity in sub-Saharan Africa by reading studies about it published in Europe or the US, but I would encourage you to develop a deeper understanding of the local context. So even if you think that your project is just crunching numbers or counting social enterprises in South Africa, if you think that what you're doing has nothing to do with history, then I really believe that you're painting an incomplete picture for yourself and your eventual readers. So there are two major lines of scholarship that I like in this kind of historical institutional area of the spectrum. The first is Salomon and Anheuer's social origins theory. Many know Salomon as the driver behind the countless Johns Hopkins mapping projects. So he has a system, he's got a track record. This was an earlier publication where the author team set out and tested an initial topology involving classifications of the type of economy, primarily based on government spending, and how it influenced the nonprofit sector, and they've followed it up with later works. More of the more recent theoretical activity in this area has been done with Janelle Carolyn and various co-author teams she's been a part of. She develops a more nuanced and, as you can see from the diagram, more nuanced and complicated approach of classifying societies. And later works have found strong but not universal support for her comprehensive approach. I also know of at least one article that critiques the approach, and she's actually a co-author on the article that critiques her approach, which I think I've always respected a little bit more. And both of these lines of literature, though, have concentrated on the historical institutional element that I think is present in almost all comparative work. So historical institutional components are always there. These two lines of research has been kind of the main dish, but regardless of whether it's your main dish, it's always going to be there. So you don't need to go this deep, but this is always there, whether it's the main point of what you're researching or not. And now we start getting into the really messy concepts, norms and culture. So concepts such as what responsible governance is varies widely. And in a tie back to something earlier on the spectrum, featured prominently in the ICSEM project, kind of an interesting aside, I remember the heated discussions about the questions that would be included in the survey or the interview protocol for that section. And I remember most of the really interested parties were European. The US contingent was far more interested in other factors other than governance. So food for thought, if you want that as a paper idea, have at. In addition to governance, also ownership. Whether we're talking about ownership of a corporation, whether we're talking about whether an asset lock is required to do to provide social goods, these are ownership questions. We could also be talking about whether private ownership as a thing is essential to produce public goods, or whether the state could or should own the means of production for public goods. All of these are conceptual questions that kind of get into the deeper norm cultural kind of elements of the research. And there are two areas where I think this comes up quite often in studying the charitable sector. The first is around the concept of profit, and the second is around religion. Regardless of the legality of profit, the appropriateness of charities having earned income varies. I was having a conversation with a local elected politician recently about charities, and they assumed that every charity is primarily sustained by donations, which simply is not true in the US context. The charities in the US are also allowed to retain earnings, though there are other nations where this is either not allowed at all, or only with express permission from the government, such as in Canada. So even in the, what I would consider profit-friendly US, there are still colleagues at other universities who, when teaching financial management for charities, need to use the word profit-able rather than the word profitable. Because they've been advised by their local community and stakeholders in the university that profitable is not a word that should be associated with nonprofits. Instead, they need to split the word up. So even in the US, there are local contexts that you need to be cognizant of, even in saying the word profit. And then religion also plays a role in many ways in the nonprofit sector. And this can be on the money side. So a large religious community often means that it is a funnel for donations. In the US context, this means that the donations enter kind of a black box, because the US doesn't require churches to publicly disclose their financials like it does other charities. Canada does, but the US does not. Or on the operational side, in many places, the church plays a large role in actually delivering public goods and services. I remember doing work on the impact of recessions in Latin America. So it was back in my economist days, and whether it impacted people's trust of each other and in institutions. In explaining some of my results, which were that people lost faith in the church and gained trust in the state during economic recessions, I said that people were just looking favorably on the social assistance during times of need, and that's what made them like government more. But this was turned on its head by an individual reviewer that pointed out that actually most of the social services in the areas that I was studying were provided by the church and not the government, and that I had it backwards. Further, misunderstanding the role of the church had caused me to misunderstand other dynamics in the society that had a direct bearing on what I thought was just an econometrics issue. So to borrow a phrase from Robert Putnam, it's important to observe that we may all be bowling alone, but it's even more important to understand the social mechanics behind why. And here, I think my recommended readings are just a little bit different than what you might expect. I do like this first one. It's written by lawyers, but approaches the kind of meaty topics that we've been dealing with, like the legitimacy of who governs. But then in the second bit, I really encourage people to snuggle up with a nice cup of coffee and some nice heterodox economics, because really, despite the recent popular attention given to behavioral economics, there have been people trying to more accurately model the behavior of real human beings long before Freakonomics. Which continent you live on has likely determined which, if any, of these individuals that you've read. I have 2 degrees in economics, a bachelor's and master's, yet had never heard of, I actually don't even know if it's Polanyi or Polanyi, until I went to my first European Social Enterprise Conference. And then I was probably literally the only one in the room that had not read any. And many of the Europeans I spoke with had never heard of John Commons or some of the other old school institutional economists. So I strongly encourage everyone, especially if you've never had an interest in economics before, to take a look at some of these more heterodox classics, because these are individuals who have been struggling to put together the system of humans and how they behave with norms and culture and values for quite some time. And even though they may not be 100% accurate, I think you'll walk away from each of these pieces thinking a little bit differently about some ideas. All right, which brings us to the most nebulous concept of all, public. If the social sector is here to provide for the public or to provide public goods, what does that mean? What does public mean? How does it define what the social economy is? How does it impact our theories? How does the fact that it shifts when we cross borders, how does that impact the theories that we have? Is it really a theory if it only works in one society and not the other? These are all kinds of questions that I've actually personally had to start asking when internationalizing a financial management theory called benefits theory. So benefits theory is a theory of nonprofit finance developed by Dennis Young. It describes the link between the type of good or service provided and the ideal type of finance to produce that good or service. Now, this depends on, so this entire relationship depends on the type of good. Is it public? Is it private? Or is it a blend? So we have this graph that you see displaying different characteristics of goods. So we have rivalry and excludability, and things that are highly rivalrous and highly excludable. So basically you can keep people from having it, and once you have it, it's gone. That these types of goods are designed for earned income streams. So up there in the cupcake corner. So in the US context, which is where benefits theory was developed, this is how the theory kind of laid itself out. But as we started to see whether or not this applied in other contexts, we discovered that it's really not just about what type of revenue happens to be popular in that country or what the social norms are. It also is even the definition of what public means. So here in the US, we think of, cupcake, private good. It's, something you find in the local bakery. But what if your government has provided cupcakes for everyone for the last 200 years? What if we change the word cupcake to measles vaccine or primary school? Both of those things you can keep people from attending or getting. And once you use the vaccine, it's gone. But how does it change? So on one hand, this is just a money question. What's the best type of income stream in order to support a particular good that a nonprofit is producing? It's just money. But you know what? On the other hand, it's a question about who we are, who our society is. So it's all tied together. So that brings us to best practices, and I know I'm out of time. So the best practices are ones that we've already mentioned. So definitely work with a local academic or data caretaker in addition to a CPA or attorney. Be sure that you over-document at every stage. Be very aware of your own lived context and expectations, and definitely over-communicate any decisions you make in curating your data. So if you're dropping anything, if you're cleaning anything, be sure that anyone who is using that data knows it. And if you are a new data owner, then be sure that you always credit and consider where you found it. Think about the publicness of the end product. We all need more data. The world is a better place with more data. So think about whether this is something that you can share with the world. If it is, I strongly encourage you to make a user's guide and to think at every junction about the academic, practitioner, and policy implications of what it is that you're researching and about the data that you're putting together. All right, so thank you so much for listening for so long. And I am happy to answer any questions that we still have time for. Alasdair?
Excellent. Thank you very much, Elizabeth. That was great. It was a really rich exploration of using data to answer questions comparatively across borders, and I think also, well, some good cautionary tales for researchers that might be tempted to jump into making rough and ready comparisons and find that there are various traps and pitfalls that have to be avoided. So we've got time for a few questions. We've got some from the comments. If anyone else would like to ask any questions, then please put them into the comments. But we'll start with one from the comments, though. So I guess we're focusing there mostly on the sort of administrative or regulatory data there. We had a question about what you think about more survey-based measures, such as the Charities Aid Foundation's World Giving Index, that are based on surveys rather than the sort of regulatory data. Mm-hmm. Do you have thoughts or opinions on that?
Well, I do, and I think generally, I think that all data is good. You just need to know how to handle it and understand where it's from. So there are many pieces. The reason I think I have a tendency to focus on the regulatory data is because it's extensively documented, and people will call if something happens to be irregular. But there are some other providers of data and information that I think are extremely high quality. I've used the World Values Survey in addition to some other ones, and I think that anytime you use data, whether it's from survey data that's administered by government or any agency, you just need to be very cognizant of the organization that conducted it. So think about, I don't want to say think about agendas because that makes it sound Machiavellian, but think about lenses. So researchers have lenses, organizations have lenses, and always be sure, again, have that survey instrument. So it's not just about the form, have whatever the lived experience of the people that answered the survey is, so that you know what it was that they were facing. And then read all documentation that you can get on the actual mechanics of how they put the survey together. Did they use weights? Who did they talk to? What were those decisions? Where did they go? So that you know whether or not that information only speaks to certain subsegments or whether it speaks to kind of a broader audience. So all data is good. You just have to know the characteristics of it and how it can be properly understood and used.
Yeah, no, I think that's fair. You're actually still sharing your screen. I don't know if you can switch back to the camera.
Sure thing. I thought that was something you commandeered. So do I just unclick that button? There we go.
Yeah, that's the one. Yeah, perfect. Excellent. So the second question, then I guess particularly from early on in your talk, where you were talking about building crosswalks, but also as you're addressing the sort of issues you were talking about in thinking about how comparative data is and building those data, there's quite a lot of work in doing that. I mean, how good do you think we are at sharing and avoiding duplication of that sort of work?
Mm-hmm. I think that there's a tension, especially in academia, because if you are in a tenure system and you're pre-tenure, then your personal incentives are there to have this pile of beautiful data, and only you can use it, and you're like Gollum, and it's yours. But that's not really the way that we're going to all move forward, because it's in our own best interests to put these together to avoid, like what you said, duplication of effort, in addition to just kind of quality control. So you could be absolutely fastidious about data quality, but you may still misunderstand what trading means, which I did. So I think that you have to. So we're getting better about sharing, and the nonprofit Open Data Collective, and I think that there are other efforts that are making that happen in a much quicker way than we have over the last 10 years in terms of bringing these kind of massive data sets online. But I think that the incentives don't line up, at least for pre-tenure faculty, to have that happen. So there are institutional motivational changes that need to happen, so that there's more kind of data sharing. And I think that some journals, ones that are requiring the submission of data at the same time that you submit your article, just to make sure that you're doing your job right, I think is a step in the right direction. But I think that the best news for data openness right now are coming from tenured faculty, which is awesome. But I'd love for the other incentives to kind of all be in line.
Sure. Yeah. No, that makes sense. And then one last question. Yeah, so you finish up with that point in your best practices about the importance of having connections to people with that knowledge of that context, the local academics or people using the data in the sector, or with experience of what the data means. And you obviously gave some examples from your own work of where you have collaborations like that. Do you have any tips or suggestions for people that are wanting to do comparative work but don't have those connections that are looking to make those sorts of connections?
Well, one is just reach out. So find the people whose work you like, or whose work is close to what you're doing. So if you're an academic and you're looking for other academics, then think about it. You would love to hear from another academic saying, "Hey, I think what you do is really cool. Do you want to, call me up? Let's talk, Scottish data sometime." That's the way this works. But I also don't think that it has to be that way. So, for example, especially in terms of practitioners, the likely the way that I am going to get a Canadian accountant is either by asking the Canadian faculty I know there if they know of someone, or by reaching out and contacting the industry body and asking them for recommendations on whom to talk to. So some of this is just getting out there and asking. And I know that that's not, it's nice to have it's more comfortable to have kind of the bigger referral networks, but honestly, a lot of this is find the people that are doing what you respect, whether that's practitioner or academic, and ask, because we like knowing that someone else thinks that we're knowledgeable, and provided that you made a good initial pick, then more than likely you'll be able to work that out.
Yeah, that's good advice. Excellent. Thanks again, Elizabeth. That was really good. Really good presentation and some good discussion. As I said at the start, this is the final seminar of our 2018-2019 season. We will return after the summer in September with a new program of monthly seminars. If you would like to present your work related to nonprofit data in some way, then please do contact me. Details are in the description below. And if you're new to the series, you can access recordings of past seminars through the GitHub page or through the YouTube channel. Again, links are below, so please check them out. Share them with others that you think might be interested. Thanks again for joining us, and goodbye.